It's like we're building our society from an Etch-a-Sketch. We were given a solid foundation and a warning of what dangers to avoid. At some point, someone came along and drew dicks all over our Etch-a-Sketch. We are afraid to lose our work, for it had such potential, but it is dead. It has been hijacked, and we need to shake it clean. George Orwell stated that the best books are the ones that tell you what you already know. 1984 will tell you what you already know, that there is something very wrong with our culture. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. These were the three slogans of Ingsoc, the totalitarian party which controlled the superstate of Oceania in George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984. These slogans were precisely chosen to create cognitive dissonance in the citizens' minds. Each slogan uses words directly contradictory to one another. It was a concept known by party members as doublethink, to hold paradoxical views of reality simultaneously in your mind. You are asked to completely disregard your own perception and be completely dependent on the state's definition of reality. If the party needed you to believe that 2 + 2 = 5, then you have to find some way to resolve the fact that you know it equals 4. It is not just enough to say the words. The party was very sophisticated in observing when you were faking it. You needed to actually believe when a party member holds up 2 and 2 fingers, you are truly seeing 5. Furthermore, if the party puts you in a situation where 2 + 2 must equal 4, for the sake of science and practicality, you must find a way to resolve these two paradigms as the party saw fit. Sometimes the answer was 5, sometimes it was 3, and sometimes it was all of them at once. The party specifically denies that such a thing as the truth even exists. The objective truth is whatever suits their needs at the time. Ingsoc controls all records, all memories of past events, and they control your entire reality. There would be no loyalty, but loyalty to the party. There would be no love, but love for Big Brother. The validity of the human experience and the very existence of external reality itself was denied by their philosophy. The greatest of all heresies was common sense. And the most terrifying thing about this proposition was not that they would kill you for thinking otherwise. What was truly terrifying was what if they were right? For if common sense truths like 2 + 2 = 4, or the existence of gravity, or that the past is unchangeable, if these ideas exist only in the mind, and the mind is controllable, what happens then? The truth becomes whatever those in power want it to be. The way this manifested in Orwell's nightmarish reality was this. If someone you knew disappeared, they were no longer a person, and in fact never existed. Any record of them was wiped out. Any memory you had of them was false. It was your imagination, and speaking about them could lead to your own sudden disappearance. The state of Oceania had two main rivals, Eurasia and Eastasia. Whoever they were at war with in this moment was who they had always been at war with. Even if you had a memory of being at war with Eastasia 4 weeks ago, right now, we are at war with Eurasia and had always been at war with Eurasia. Any piece of news that had ever said otherwise was altered. Anyone who spoke to the contrary was a criminal. When the planes hit the two towers on 9/11, it was very clear what we needed to do. We needed to find who was responsible and crush them. Osama bin Laden was responsible. Osama bin Laden had always been responsible. This led to an all-out war in Afghanistan. Afghanistan had always been behind the terror attacks on 9/11. So as the war with Iraq waged on, we knew they had always had weapons of mass destruction. We all knew we had to rid this evil, totalitarian country of these weapons. So as the war in Afghanistan continued, we came to the realization that Iraq never had weapons of mass destruction, but this was okay. That had never been the reason for going to war in the first place. What Iraq really needed was a regime change. Whoever controls the present controls the past, and thus controls the future. Those who control our history books are able to control our perception of the past. Like most kids in America, I was taught that no matter which war we were fighting, the United States was on the side of God, truth, and justice. But history proves to be much more complex than our linear way of learning in schools allows us to understand. Every historical subject we learn gets condensed into a narrow lens, usually portraying and imposing on us a belief of American exceptionalism. God's chosen people who have been burdened with the task of enlightening other cultures of their primitive ways. In the 241 years since 1776, the United States has been engaged in some type of war for 224 of them. War, in reality, by definition, should be something that inevitably comes to an end. There is a clear enemy, we fight, we go until there is a clear victor, then the war ends. The wars between Oceania, East Asia, and Eurasia were not battles over resources. War was enacted to keep a labor force within its own boundaries. In Orwell's novel, by becoming continuous, war has ceased to exist. Each world power stockpiles atomic weapons and points them at each other, planning and plotting for the right moment. Of course, this moment never comes, and the leaders of Ingsoc never want it to come. None of the three powers ever attempt any maneuver which involves the risk of serious defeat. In this way, vague battles and wars are being fought. It could be true, it could be a lie. The citizens of Oceania have no way of knowing. The real truth is that each superstate is nearly identical to one another, with only slight differences in way of life and ideology. This is why each superstate does not want to conquer one another. If you were to conquer a new territory, what would you do with its people? You could either have a mass genocide, or you can assimilate these people into your own society. That would be almost unthinkable. If the residents of Oceania actually mingled with the enemy that had been propped up for so long, soon they would come to realize that they are more similar to themselves than they could have ever imagined. In Orwell's reality, war is waged by each ruling class against its own subjects. The object of war is not to take or prevent conquest of territory, but to keep the very structure of society intact. A hierarchical society requires a certain way of thinking, particularly a feeling of scarcity and lack, that straying too far from the herd will result in death. When war becomes literally continuous, there is no such thing as military necessity. The war becomes merely an imposter. It becomes like a battle between two animals who have set their horns at such an angle that they are incapable of hurting one another. This is not to say that many people won't die. Certainly they will. But the foundation of these superpowers' way of life is never in danger for even an instant. Though it is just an act, it is not meaningless. War eats up the surplus of consumable goods, and it helps to preserve the mental atmosphere that a hierarchical society requires. A state of perpetual war has become nearly identical to a state of perpetual peace. Throughout recorded time, there has always been three types of people: the high, the middle, and the low. They have been subdivided many ways, borne countless names, but the essential structure of society has never changed. Even after enormous upheavals, the same pattern has always reasserted itself, just as a gyroscope will always return to equilibrium. The aims of these three groups are entirely irreconcilable. The aim of the high is to remain where they are. The aim of the middle is to overthrow and change places with the high. And the aim of the low, if they have an aim, is to abolish all distinctions and create a society where all are equal. Thus, a struggle which maintains the same basic outline recurs over and over again. The need for a hierarchical society had always been the doctrine of the high. The high had promised you safety and security, and all the riches available in the next life. All it asked in return was everything, all of the riches in this world. There are four ways in which a ruling class can fall from power. Either it is conquered from without, it governs so poorly that the masses revolt, it allows a strong, discontented middle group to develop, or it loses self-confidence and willingness to govern. A ruling class which could guard against all of these would remain in power permanently. The high, realizing history was a cyclical process and that the middle and low would always try to usurp their status, chose to find a way to maintain their position permanently. This new group of high was more conscious of what they were doing and more focused on crushing their opposition. This new group of high realized the only way to keep an oligarchy intact was through collectivism. A society needed to exist where the greater good of the group always had priority over the individual. One of the main mistakes these groups made in the past was the forming of an aristocracy. The privileged few flaunted themselves. They had slaves. They made it very clear that they were the high and we were the low. Once the high had an overwhelming amount of resources, the middle would inevitably enlist the low to overthrow the high, usually to a violent end. The key to success needed to be secrecy and shadowed intentions. The new oligarchy, the one that can actually maintain their status as the high, will have to learn how to hide their true aims. Today, the high are no longer people. They are corporations and institutions. Institutions which are too big to fail. They become something like the Federal Reserve. The very name a brilliant act of doublethink. It would suggest to an observer that they are beholden to the federal government and that they hold the reserve of our currency. In reality, they are not a part of the federal government, nor do they hold any reserves. They are a nameless, faceless, shape-shifting entity with no loyalty or ties to anyone or anything. Nathan Rothschild once said, "Give me control of a nation's wealth, and I care not who makes its laws." Once you have gained complete control of a nation's wealth, you can then plaster the face of a big brother who is always watching you onto every TV, every street corner, and in every home, while the high remain truly anonymous. Through collectivism, the high are able to keep up the illusion that we have not been enslaved. People are not productive when we realize our enslavement. Our human spirit compels us to break free of our masters. And furthermore, when you knowingly enslave someone, you don't want to educate them, for they may use it to turn against you. So you are only able to take advantage of the muscle of your human farm, and not the most valuable asset, their mind. Give them the illusion of freedom. Let them choose their job, where they want to vacation, and how they want to spend their free time. They will choose a job that is safe and secure. Though they have the ability to go as far and for as long as they want, they will vacation where countless people have gone before and will always return home when they are told. And inevitably, almost all our various forms of entertainment will merely become a way to numb our senses. Give them the illusion of choice and they will imprison themselves. Thus, freedom is slavery. In 1984, the Ingsoc Party was in the middle of implementing a new type of language called, quite creatively, Newspeak. It would take time, however, to replace all the unnecessary Oldspeak words with the more useful, efficient Newspeak words. Words that meant the same thing were thrown away. Why did words like fantastic, ecstatic, and amazing exist when they could be covered by the word good? If something was better, it would be double good. Something bad was simply ungood. Language was simplified as much as possible. The goal of the party was to have any idea divergent from the Ingsoc doctrine literally unthinkable. All ambiguity and shades of meaning were purged out. Newspeak was designed to limit the range of thought, and there would be no room for philosophical discussion. In a world like this, how could one fight back when the thoughts and words of a revolution couldn't even be thought or spoken? Look at this example from Orwell's article, Politics in the English Language, which shows the path modern-day English is heading down. He takes a verse from Ecclesiastes and translates it into a more modern-day English type of writing. "I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill. But time and chance happeneth to them all." Let's look at how the same sentence would be written in a more modern-day English type of writing. Objective considerations of contemporary phenomena compel the conclusion that success or failure in competitive activities exhibits no tendency to be commiserate with innate capacity, but that a considerable element of the unpredictable must invariably be taken into account. The first sentence contains 49 words but only 60 syllables, and all its words are those of everyday life. The second contains 38 words of 90 syllables. Every form of imagery and concrete illustration has dissolved into these vague phrases, and despite its 90 syllables, it gives us only a shortened version of the meaning contained in the first. Yet without a doubt, it is the second kind of sentence which is gaining ground in modern English. This type of writing is useful if one wants to hide their meaning, and in political language, this is everything. For those who climb to power must always portray their reasons for doing so as noble. They did it for truth, God, and justice. This is rarely true. Power has always been acquired for power's sake. Orwell realized this and realized that this trick is often masked by language. Leaders, politicians, and media often use soft language to mask a brutal reality. British rule in India, the Russian purges and deportations under Stalin, the dropping of the atom bombs on Japan, can be defended, but only by arguments which are too brutal for most people to face, and which do not align with the professed aims of the political parties. Euphemism is what makes up the majority of our political language. Defenseless villages are bombed from the air, the inhabitants driven out into the countryside, the cattle machine gun and the home set on fire. This was called pacification. Such phraseology is needed if one wants to name things without calling up mental pictures of them. This is the trick. You use a nice name for a horrific thing. Political writing and speech is often a defense of the indefensible. Very often the words chosen directly contradict the ideas they represent. This kind of speech is not hard to recognize, so the speaker is dependent on one key fact about human nature, and that is the individual's desire to deceive himself. We all have a story, a sort of internal narrative which shapes our identity and molds our perception. In 1984, the narrative was that Big Brother was omnipotent and the party was infallible. But because Big Brother was not omnipotent and the party was not infallible, there was need for an unvarying, moment-to-moment flexibility in the treatment of facts. One needed control over their own mental processes as complete as that of a contortionist over his body. In Newspeak, this was called doublethink. Doublethink lies at the very heart of Ingsoc way of life, since the essential act of the party is to use conscious deception while retaining the firmness of purpose that goes with complete honesty. To tell deliberate lies while genuinely believing in them. This brings up the question, why must reality be distorted in this manner? Why must the narrative pervade every layer of the societal structure? It is important to realize that power is in the collective. Alone, every human being will fail, because every human being is doomed to die. But if he can make complete, utter submission, if he can escape his identity, if he can merge himself into the party so that he is the party, then he is all-powerful and immortal. You see then why you must never lose faith in the infallibility of your country or political group. These things make up the foundation of how you interpret the world, and if they collapse, your entire structure of beliefs will collapse with it. This is why, above all, the story, the narrative, and the mythology must remain intact, and why you will follow your culture down whatever path it leads you. This is footage of the Soviet Union under the rule of Joseph Stalin. From his rise to power in 1924 and his death in 1953, Stalin was responsible for the deaths of 30 to 50 million Russian citizens. 14 million people were imprisoned in the labor camps from 1929 to 1953. Secret police patrolled the streets, and 1 in 3 citizens were government spies. For those of us who are not there, we will never truly understand the atmosphere of suspicion, brutality, and neighbor spying on neighbor which made up day-to-day life. When George Orwell wrote Animal Farm in 1984, he was not writing about some future society. He was writing about the world he saw right in front of his eyes. Not merely the brutality of the communist regime, but the fact that the rest of the world chose to be willfully blind to what was happening. You have to understand, at this time, no media outlet was willing to print any material which was critical of the Soviet Union. For the world had just witnessed the Soviet forces defeat the seemingly unstoppable army of Hitler. So collectively, we stuck our head in the sand, because that was the convenient thing to do. George Orwell was the worst kind of political writer. He had the terrible habit of telling people precisely what they did not want to hear. We tend to think of an oppressive regime as containing 2 categories of people: the oppressive ruling class and the innocent people who are being oppressed. We think of tyranny as something which comes from the top down, but a system like that simply would not function. Regimes like that of Stalin or Hitler required the willing participation of a mass amount of people. This does not fit very well with our perception of what happened. It is much easier to look at history as a case of black and white, right and wrong, or good and evil. And each of us would like to believe, if we were put in that situation, we would take the side of good. If only it were that simple. If only there were some unmistakable mark of evil, we could simply separate the good from the bad. But the line between good and evil does not pass through political parties, nor states, nor social classes, but right through every human heart. This runs absolutely counter to what we would like to believe. We like our villains out in the open, where they can be easily identified. But it was not good men or bad men who were behind the horrors of Auschwitz and Soviet Russia. It was ordinary men, people just like you and me. To truly understand Nazi Germany or Stalin's Russia is to understand that ordinary people, meaning you and I, if we were put in that situation, we would have done what ordinary people did. What every totalitarian state had in common was a layer of deceit embedded within its culture and within its language, and a willingness of the individual to accept and act out endless lies. This is what Orwell so eloquently brought to light in Politics in the English Language. And if you only read one article in your life, make it this one. Speaking in an imprecise manner lays the groundwork for a society built on conscious deception. And it starts at the level of the individual. We cannot lay responsibility at the feet of another. For the enemy is not some dictator in a faraway land. When we realize the enemy lies within our own hearts, suddenly, one becomes two. We have found the enemy, and he is us.
Nightlight in my bed, not safe and sound in my own head. Light won't keep my shadow away. Are you okay? There's monsters in my head, and there's nothing you can do. I left the party with glitter still in my hand. Should have stayed home tonight, but you knew that I'd come. We were drinking in your friend's room. There was nothing to regret, yeah. There was nothing to regret until you tried to kiss me on the bed. You broke your promise. You broke something too. Nightlight in my bed, not safe and sound in my own head. Light won't keep my shadow away. Are you okay? There's monsters and there's nothing you can do.